When I first learned of React Server components a few months ago, I had a ton of questions. What are they? How do they relate to server-side rendering? I'd also heard of things like Suspense and server actions, and I wondered how they related to React Server components, if at all. At the same time, I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the discussion around React Server components orientated around Next.js, and I wasn't really sure where that line was between a React feature and a Next feature. These last few weeks, I've been experimenting with RSC, reading all about it, and having some conversations with friends about their experience using RSC in their projects and in production. It sounds like what you're describing is fundamentally different model.
It's a fundamentally different model compared to how we develop React applications already.
Now, the goal in this video is to help you do what I had to work to achieve, which is assemble a mental model around React Server components so that we can understand what problem do they solve, what are the benefits, and where do they fit within a modern React application. The aim here isn't necessarily to provide a tutorial. This isn't a step-by-step kind of video, but if you can identify with any of the questions I just shared, you're going to get the answers by the end. I'm calling this a no-nonsense guide, and that just means I'm going to get right into it when I talk about a little bit of history around React Server components. Hi, I'm Alex Booker with Ably, the real-time infrastructure API. Let's get into it. Before jumping into it, I want to acknowledge that the idea behind React Server components surfaced more than 3 years ago, but back then it was just an idea in research and development. It's only very recently that Next 13.4 and their app router provided a path and the tools necessary to start using the server components model in production, so we are in early days here. Now, when you hear server-side components, it might be tempting to think server-side rendering or SSR, and that is part of it. But if I can offer you one piece of advice going into the video, it would be to put aside that notion for the time being. Something a little bit tricky about React Server components is that on the surface, they sound like they are just a React feature, maybe one to do with server-side rendering and therefore performance. But actually, at a high level, I would encourage you to not think of RSC as a feature, but as a fundamentally new model or paradigm for building full-stack React applications that results in us as developers writing less and simpler code. What is the implication of a new model like this? Well, for one thing, in practical terms, it means RSC only makes sense within the context of a full-stack React meta framework. And those meta frameworks have to adopt the new model. That's exactly what Next 13.4 and that app router did, by the way. And to my previous question, that's probably why RSC and Next often come up in the same sentence a lot of the time. They overhauled their bundler to make it aware of React Server components, and they rewrote their entire routing API to embrace this new model, which you're going to learn about today. At the time of this recording, Next is the only meta framework to implement the React team's full-stack architecture vision with RSC, but other meta frameworks like Remix aren't far behind. Okay, with the introduction out of the way, what is a React Server component? A React Server component is a new type of React component that runs exclusively on the server and returns some HTML, which is then sent to the client. Because the component only runs on the server, you can do things that look kind of wild, like run a database query within your component. Because the component only runs on the server, that also means you can't do things like use state or even attach a click event handler directly, because that would only make sense if this code was running on the browser. Since Next 13.4, all components are now server components by default. Traditional components that run in the browser and use state, they still exist, but they're now called client components, and they have to be explicitly marked as such with a new use client directive. This is so different from anything we've seen in the React universe before, and if you're anything like me, your brain might already be whirring, thinking, what? How do we do dynamic stuff on the client then? There are ways, and they're really well thought out. Let's take a closer look with some examples. Say we have a form and we want to submit it asynchronously. In the past, we would have done something that looks like this. So it would be very natural to wonder how you can make this type of code work within a server component, even though we can't use state or access the browser API. But I can assure you from experience that this is a red herring. Remember, we're dealing with a fundamentally new paradigm here. In this fresh paradigm, rather than wiring up an event handler and teeing up a post request like we might have before, with Next, you can use a React feature related to server components called server actions. With server actions, you add an action attribute to your server component form with a function to run when the form is submitted. When you're coding in the browser, the action attribute needs to be a URL, but in the Next universe, the form action attribute has been adopted to accept a function which always runs on the server. Again, we call these server actions, and they need to exist in a file with use server at the top. Here, I'm simply inserting the form data into the database. Let me show you this working, and I have to say it's a little bit magic. When we run the application and submit the form is submitted asynchronously. What's more, notice how the component re-rendered to show the newly added item. I call this a magic trick because, a little bit like magic, I can't exactly explain how it works. What I can show you though is that when we submit the form, a post request is sent under the hood. This is doing exactly what we wanted to do manually with our event handler and whatever, calling the post request manually, but we didn't have to do any of that stuff. I should also point out that there's no page reload here when we submit the form. In the same round trip, the server returns an updated representation of the components, which React then dynamically replaces in the DOM. It's worth belaboring the point that back in ancient times, or 2023, the component would always execute in the browser. With RSC, however, the component is executed on the server returns some HTML, basically, and React cleverly, or magically, depending on how you want to look at it, replaces the component's representation in the DOM. In fact, if we look a bit closer at the network inspector here, you can see that post request in the response, instead of just some generic status message, it actually contains the HTML for the components. React is then intelligently replacing the HTML on the page with this returned HTML. Where did this HTML come from? Well, in the action, we call a function called revalidate path, and that tells Next to essentially rerun the server components and return the HTML with the action. We now know that server actions can work with a form, and forms make a lot of sense when you want to create, update, or potentially delete data. But what if we want to read some new data dynamically based on a client event? As it happens, if you call revalidate path inside of a server action, there's really no need to reload the client because React can do that for you as part of the same round trip, which is good for efficiency, but pretty bad for my video where I want to give you an example. So let's come up with a new scenario. Say we've got two windows here and another user starts adding items to the database. At the moment, we won't see those updates unless we do a hard web browser refresh or submit the form, which triggers that server-side render like we saw previously. Let's consider how we would implement a JavaScript reload button, and to keep it interesting, let's ask the user to confirm if they want to reload. This requirement is a stupid user experience, but it puts us firmly in client land where we need to interact with the browser confirm function. In other words, this component physically can't run in a server component because it needs to access the browser API. Now, earlier I said you can't do things like use state, effects, or event listeners directly in a server component. The operative word there was directly. You can actually reference a client component that lives in a different file with a use client directive from within a server component, and React is quite clever about bringing this to life. Here's the code for the client component. You'll see I've added the confirm button just to prove that when we run this, we're actually in client land and everything works. But here's a challenge for you, and before answering, I invite you to remember that red herring I mentioned before around trying to do things in the old way. The challenge is, how would you propose we dynamically reload the data? Feel free to have a think, but here's the answer. In the old world, you might do something like this, but that's the red herring. With RSC, and this will take a moment to explain, we can simply call router.refresh or router.refresh. This is where things continue to get really exciting in my opinion, because when we press the button, Next re-renders the server component and merges the component payload without losing unaffected client-side React or browser state. Listen, I don't know how compilers work. I don't know how the virtual DOM does what it does under the hood. I don't feel like I need to understand how this works. What I can show you though is when we call router.reload, under the hood, React makes the fetch request for us. We can quite easily reason that React runs the server components, which maybe you get the idea. Server components return HTML, which next relays to the browser in the response. And then, as if by magic, React figures out where to slot it in the DOM. This is all really cool, and I've been playing around with it a lot. The other week, I was building a to-do list app with RSC, as you do, and I wanted to update the to-do in the database as being done when the user checks the done box. I was thinking like, okay, do I need to use a form for this? But then making a form for each to-do list item didn't make sense. That's when I learned, actually, you can call server actions, which is a reminder, they live in their own file with use server at the top. You can call server actions in a client component event handler, and Next will figure it out. Now, I can't begin to tell you how this works, but to me, it's quite illustrative that with RSC, this gap between server and client, it doesn't really exist anymore. It's new, and new things can feel odd, I grant you, but the backend and front end are no longer split down the middle. It's a little bit weird, but like swimming, touch typing, or learning 90s on Fortnite, with some practice, seamlessly blending between the server and client becomes intuitive, and I like that. Let's unpack the benefits a bit more so you can decide if RSC is something you want to consider for your next project. I think that as developers, we're getting a really nice developer experience here. Data fetching at the component level like this makes the loading logic better co-located where it's used, and that's kind of nice. And then the obvious win here is that server actions eliminate the need to define mutation APIs. This is because, as you've seen, client code can call directly to the server side, and the framework handles all the RPC details. We also saw there's no need to use data fetching libraries like fetch or SWR anymore. You could even say that RSC eliminates the API layer. In other words, that's less code to read, write, and maintain, and that can only be a good thing, in my opinion. At the very beginning of this video, or when it was still light outside, I mentioned that if you are familiar with SSR, you might be better off putting that idea to one side for the time being. As this video draws to a close, I want to invite you to bring SSR back into the mix, because this new model Dev and I are talking about fits in very well with SSR. As a gentle reminder, SSR allows us to put something material in front of the user as quickly as possible while the app hydrates with interactivity and event handlers. This isn't a video about server-side rendering. I think it might get a bit too long if we go down that path, but I did really want to show you something, which is streaming with Next, React Server components, and a new concept I'm about to share called Suspense. Okay, say you have a server component that takes a few seconds to render because of a database query. In that case, the first page load might be painfully slow for the user. So much so, they might click off and go somewhere else, which is no good. With RSC, you can now wrap that slower to load component in a suspense boundary along with a placeholder. I'm using text, but this could be a skeleton, for example, and React will show the placeholder while the suspended component finishes. In slightly more technical terms, looking at the code here, the component responds immediately with non-suspense components and then streams in additional HTML from suspended components without the need to block on the server or coordinate asynchronous requests. When the page loads, the user sees the layout immediately. Then, the instant the component is available, you can probably imagine how React is building on that same fundamental idea of replacing components in the DOM with the server-generated HTML, maybe illustrating a bit how all these pieces work together to make this new model work. I mean, come on, this is pretty nice. I really wanted to show it off as something that works well with React Server components. If you're wondering how SSR relates to React Server components, I really liked this video from Kadapus Academy that I'm linking in the show notes. My friend, Josh Komau, actually, I'm more of a fan. I love Josh's work. He also has a fantastic bit of content on RSC that talks a bit about the evolution of React Server components alongside server-side rendering, and he points out what we're uniquely gaining compared to previous server-side rendering tactics or methods. Server-side rendering can be associated with performance in the end app because you put something in front of the user more quickly while you wait for the app to hydrate and data to funnel in. Another performance benefit that I feel obliged to touch on quickly before wrapping up here is that by primarily running components on the server, we only need to send the minimum amount of HTML to the client instead of the whole libraries necessary to produce that same HTML. A simple example would be if we wanted to format a timestamp next to each item in our list. Instead of distributing the timestamp formatting library to the client, that dependency only lives and only runs on the server. We run it on the server to produce the HTML, but only the thinnest possible sliver of HTML and maybe CSS that the client needs. It's really funny to me because when people talk about React Server components, this is like the first thing they talk about, but this is my interpretation of RSC, and I think this is among the less exciting things compared to this new paradigm we get, compared to this way that we can stream data to the browser as it becomes available. But it is a pertinent point because part of the motivation for RSC is performance. And I can totally see as server components become the default in frameworks like Next, this is the kind of thing that can add up over time to really reduce the client-side weight of your application. There is, however, some debates within the community about the net gain of optimizations like this, while you're also burdening the weight of a meta framework to accomplish it. At the beginning of the video, I made a bit of a confusing statement around React Server components. It sounds like a feature, but actually it's a model. I didn't want to overload things at the beginning, but I feel like I owe it to you, the viewer, to explain that React Server components is a new model and it's also a new feature. Server actions are not React Server components. They are a separate but related feature. And Next's router, which is where we're getting the router.refresh method from and this kind of stuff, that's not specific to React Server components. I think how Remix and other meta frameworks end up adopting this model might look quite different. I like this illustration by Theo a lot. It tidily illustrates here that yes, React Server components is a feature. Technically, you can use it without a framework, and there are some very minimal ways you can bring it to life. But it's when you bring these ideas together, that's what creates the model or paradigm we've been talking about today. You can find a link to this presentation in the description, and I highly recommend it. For me, as a learner myself, I found some of the React Server component stuff a bit theoretical, when what I really wanted to answer for my purposes, and I would assume yours as well if you've watched until the end, it's more about that practical side of bringing these bits together to build applications in a new way that results in less and simpler code, and maybe makes the path towards things like server-side rendering a bit simpler. So there you have it. I really hope I've succeeded in shedding some light on RSCs and providing a bit of a model about where they fit, what the benefits are, and how you can start to leverage them in your current or future projects. A big motivation for me to make this video is that personally, I found them a little bit hard to learn because it was challenging to separate the signal from the noise, if you see what I mean. There's a lot of opinions out there on X, and there's obviously quite a few concepts at play here as well. I'm coming to this a little bit late, but I understand that for a few years now, the React team and community and the collective ecosystem have been on a path towards a cohesive, full stack React story. This is possibly, maybe, nearly the end of that story, or the first chapter in that story more likely. But the reason I acknowledge this is that 3 or 4 years down the road, there is some outdated content out there or conflicting ideas that I think would be better avoided in an introduction like this. That's why I'm calling this the no-nonsense guide to React Server components, because I'm getting, straight into the point, and hopefully you've benefited from a lot of examples. If you appreciate this approach to teaching React concepts, then please like the video here on YouTube and subscribe to the Ably YouTube channel. I'm making this video with Ably. We're a real-time infrastructure API, so if you're looking to add real-time features to your React application that work at any scale, you can check out our idiomatic React hooks. React Server components are on our mind because it's really interesting to explore how we can make these work with WebSockets, for example, so that you don't even need that reload button I showed you before. I've been Alex Booker with Ably. Thank you for watching.